So hi, everyone. My name's Brit Benjamin. I am a mother, first and last, a songwriter, a constitutional law scholar, and I founded a divorce law practice in California. So business is booming. My shtick here is a minor crusade against no-fault divorce because it fails a basic economic rationality test. It destroys lives, and relevant to this audience, it depresses birth rates. I'm going to rant for 15 minutes about no-fault divorce and why it sucks. And then I'd love to answer some questions about divorce, no-fault divorce for you in my time or over the rest of the weekend. I'm assuming a few premises that I don't have time to articulate my reasoning from first principles, but I want to state them so that my biases are known. One is that human life is good. 2 is that children are lovely. 3 is that family is central to a healthy, actualized adult life. And 4, that civilized societies enforce valid contracts. Turning to the substance, I want to share a kind of long Jordan Peterson quote that punches me in the gut every time I even think about it. Your partner has to be all in. That's why you have a marriage vow. Because the marriage vow is basically this: no matter what you tell me, I won't run away. And that's a bitch of a vow, man. Because when someone unveils their whole heart, they unveil themselves all the way down to hell. It's not pleasant. It's awful. And so they need to know that you will not run away. And that's a vow, because what do you know? Look, the person is always going to be thinking, always, if you really knew who I was, you wouldn't love me. You wouldn't want to be with me. And you know, hey, fair enough, because people are full of snakes. And if all of those snakes were revealed, perhaps the logical thing to do would be to run. And so you might say, why not run? Well, do you want to be running from everyone for the rest of your life? You want to forego the advantages of a permanent relationship? And you're full of snakes too. So you're both making a bad bet. And so you make the bad bet based on the idea that if you were faithful and if you were truthful, that you can resolve the issues. And you can. It's a good deal. Yeah, like even reading that now, it kind of punches me in the gut. We're all full of snakes. And the marriage covenant has historically been the vehicle through which we turn our snakes into virtue. Because when you're stuck together, the incentives shift, and suddenly it's, how can I make my life, and therefore the lives of my family members, better? And personal responsibility is always the answer. Marriage was historically the crucible in which young men and women became actualized adults. And because marriage once meant that you were stuck together, you had to look at yourself. Really look at yourself, look at your snakes in the eye, and take accountability for yourself, and work on yourself, and choose virtue. Otherwise, you'd be miserable and stuck together miserably. And you had the emotional safety in the bond with your permanent marriage partner to do that excruciating work honestly. Now what people do is they spend their 20s and 30s and sometimes beyond bouncing from relationship to relationship, hoping to find someone who isn't full of snakes and who will tolerate all of their unmitigated snakes. But that person doesn't exist. We're all full of snakes. I'm a divorce lawyer, and almost every single client, aside from legitimate victims of abuse or infidelity, which are fortunately relatively rare, almost every single client who comes into my office is not going to find what they're looking for outside of their marriage. Almost every marriage could be saved if both partners were willing to take radical responsibility for their own emotions, their own triggers and flaws, and commit 1,000% to finding their way through with their spouse as they vowed they would. In adopting nationwide no-fault divorce laws, we have given up on our greatest tool for personal growth, a permanent marriage covenant. So what happened? Prior to 1969, when California adopted the first no-fault divorce law, the only way to get a divorce was 1, by mutual consent of both spouses, or 2, by the party seeking the divorce proving fault on the part of their spouse. Prior to 1969, if you wanted a divorce without the consent of your spouse, you had to prove that they had substantially breached the marital contract by engaging in abuse, infidelity, abandonment, or substance abuse. There were a few other fringier grounds, but those were the main ones. America underwent what some called a sexual revolution, but which amounted to destroying the institution of marriage with the 1-2 punch of no-fault divorce and the widespread adoption of birth control pills. After California passed its no-fault paradigm, every other state followed eventually. This is where you boo. Yeah. So unenforceable contracts are not contracts. And America has turned the most sacred of all contracts, the contract that most adults build their entire lives around, into a useless fiction. And now the incentive structures of both the dating and marriage markets are absolutely perverse. In a contract, parties agree to bind their future selves to terms that there is mutual assent to. In a marriage, it was traditional that all aspects of a couple's life would become joined. They would share sex and children exclusively with one another. They would share money, and they would be yoked together in all ways. Their fates were permanently bound forward and backward through time, as if the branches and the roots of their family trees were just inextricably linked. As my beloved former father-in-law, David Friedman, has written and spoken about, the marriage contract is inherently asymmetrical, in that women perform early and men perform late. This is biological reality. It's not some misogynistic framework that the so-called patriarchy has imposed upon women. No. The biological reality is women perform the hard part of the marriage contract early in the contract time frame. So that was traditionally, and even now, birthing and rearing children. Perhaps a woman would get married at 25, and by the time she was 45, the hardest part of her job was done. The children were typically born and raised to their late teens or even adulthood, and the mother had paid in her sweat, blood, and sexual market value to bring up her husband's children well. Men, on the other hand, tend to have fewer resources at the beginning of the marriage than they do in their 40s, 50s, and 60s when their children are grown. And by those decades, men are often financially peaking and have higher sexual market value than at any other time in their lives. So this natural imbalance in the timing of peak sexual market value makes marriage the perfect tool for ensuring that the parties get the best of one another. And they are stuck together for life as the means to make this work. So an unenforceable contract around marriage means an absolutely wrecked incentive structure. Both parties have an incentive to defect. And men in the modern world have the greater incentive to defect later in the marriage after the wife has performed her role in childbearing and rearing. Anytime a contract has a performance happening out of sync, the enforceability of the contract becomes key. This incentive structure is further wrecked by the state of family law. No-fault divorce means that even when you are truly wronged in a marriage, there are few, if any, consequences. If your spouse cheats on you during your marriage and you file for divorce, a family law court will basically not want to hear about it. You don't get to keep more of the money, it has no bearing on the court's views of their fitness to parent, and many, many people end up paying spousal support or alimony to someone who cheated on them or abandoned them. I've seen many cases where 60-plus-year-old women come into my office because their 70-plus-year-old husband ran off with a 25-year-old woman, and I have to tell her that the infidelity has no impact on her case. She often has to go back to work after decades out of the workplace rearing children to make ends meet. And I've seen many male clients whose wives emotionally or physically abandoned them or cheated on them, and I have to tell them the same thing. The law doesn't really care. As far as I know, marriage contracts are the only contracts in the United States where there is no penalty for breaching them. And if a contract is unenforceable, it's not a contract. It's just something people think they might like to do if they feel like it. Maybe. But marriage matters. Beyond the personal growth and self-actualization I opened up with, we're all full of snakes. No-fault divorce has factually, statistically lowered the total fertility rates in the United States. There's all of this data from the Department of Vital Statistics that gathers data on marriage rates and fertility, and it's undeniable. As states adopted no-fault divorce paradigms, fertility rates dropped. There are a ton of papers analyzing the trend. It's clear. No-fault divorce leads to fewer babies being born. And this makes sense. The value of a marriage drops precipitously when either party can unilaterally dissolve it without legal consequences at any time. And instead of making a choice at the time of marriage and then acting decisively for the rest of their lives in alignment with that choice, spouses have to wake up every day and decide whether to choose one another again. And sometimes that choice is just too hard for them to make. In this way, marriage is like any other contract. It's only valuable because it's enforceable. No-fault divorce has rendered marriage an unsafe bet. So people are getting married later, having fewer children, and the children they do have about a 50% chance of growing up in a single-parent household. While California prompted the no-fault divorce law domino effect across the country, this is not just a blue state issue. Divorce rates in conservative states have historically been about 50% higher than the national average. Frankly, no-fault divorce laws have meant the destruction of the most fundamental birthright of children, to be raised by both parents in a stable home. For me, natalism is not just about having more children. It's about recognizing that human life is precious and worth creating more of and worth uplifting in any way possible. We know children of divorce have lower levels of well-being. On average, they do worse in school, psychological development, conduct, self-esteem, social competence, and in their relationships as adults. They're at increased risk of substance abuse issues, as well as for the physical symptoms of trauma in childhood and in their adult lives. Divorces generally leave both spouses pretty financially wrecked. It destroys the fabric of extended family that supports both adults and their children throughout their lives, and psychologically, divorce is consistently evaluated by mental health professionals as the most traumatic thing that can happen to an adult short of their spouse dying. I say all of this as a divorced single mom, without judgment. Sometimes divorce is the best of the bad available options, or sometimes it's just not a match. But our culture has landed in a weird place where divorce is no longer even seen as a tragic outcome. It's just what people do, despite the devastating impacts on adults and children. Marriage as a contract and a covenant is no longer central to our culture's view of an actualized, healthy adult life, and everyone suffers for it. So what's the solution? In 1969, the United States started a wave of adoption of no-fault divorce paradigms. This has contributed to falling birth rates, is harmful to children, and it deprives adults of a sacred opportunity for personal growth in a stable pair bond. Proponents of no-fault divorce once argued that it was needed to protect women from abuse. This is false. In the Anglo-American legal tradition, abuse by either the husband or the wife has always been a valid ground for divorce. All the adoption of no-fault divorce has done is pervert incentives in dating and marriage markets, prevented countless Americans from actualizing as full adults in a family system, and left many of our children in single-parent homes. We should realize that we tore down a Chesterton's fence prematurely. To set things back on course, we could simply change the laws back. Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, lay it on me. Is this thing on?
Oh, does it work? Okay. That was great. Thank you. I agree with that 100%, and I think it's an important pushback against the exaltation of choice and what people want, which has been all too frequent so far today. But my question is more technical. Given that, and I think this is the correct statistic because I've heard it several times, divorce is initiated about 70% of the time by the woman. You have that time waiting thing you mentioned, your former father-in-law talked about, where the woman gets the benefit of the bargain later in the marriage. Presumably, those filings are tilted towards later in the marriage. How do those two things fit together?
Let me think. Are those tilted later in marriage? I don't think they are. I think this is where the woman's interest in defection comes earlier. It comes earlier in the marriage, and that's why they filed. They're looking for things beyond stability and provision when he may not be a great provider early on in the marriage. And so I think what happens is women are expecting their husbands to change and not taking a posture of personal responsibility early in the marriage when they're sort of in a position of power relative to later in the marriage and initiate filings. In my kind of personal experience as a divorce lawyer, I think women just like when the marriage is done, they just want to get it going. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, but the filing of the divorce paperwork is not really reflective of who made the decision to divorce. It's something people do for various reasons at different times.
You mentioned that divorce rates are higher in red states than in blue states. Do you have any idea how that came to be? And also, do you have any other counterintuitive data points similar to that where you might be able to predict who might get divorced?
I don't know why. It surprises me that in red states, the divorce rates are higher. My guess is like economic security has an impact. Yeah. I don't know if that's true. I actually don't know. Counterintuitive. One interesting statistic that's very counterintuitive that I think is interesting is that there's this idea that there is a bias against men in child custody proceedings. What's actually true is that when men seek custody, either joint or sole custody, they win it 70 to 75% of the time, depending on the state that you're in. The skew against men in custody proceedings is often that they don't actually go to the court and ask for it, but when they do, they tend to be more successful, which is a good thing. Yeah, whoever, just fight for it.
I'll stand up if I win. I'm buying what you're selling, but given how commitment averse we already are, which is part of the marriage problem, wouldn't reversing the divorce laws lead to the marriage rate cratering?
Let me think. Given how commitment averse we are. I wonder, though, like the direction of causality. Like, are we commitment averse because we know marriage is a bad bet? You can get into this contract and they can breach it at any time, and then you have these unknown consequences. My guess is that if we knew that marriage was a safe way to structure your life around a contract and a covenant, people would make that bet more often. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of factors. Like at one point, marriage was seen as more of a way to unify a family and organize resources and kind of create a larger multi-generational family unit. Now that it's more about the couples and their preferences, two things. They wait longer because they feel like they have to find the perfect person. And two, people are really bad at choosing for themselves. I come from a culture, I'm Jewish, where matchmaking is plays a very significant role in how we find partners. The thing with matchmaking is that your parents know what your values are, they know what you're like in the deepest sense, but they don't have your trauma. So what we do now that we're choosing our own partners is we're like, which one of you has the trauma that's going to be like most triggering for me? And we pick people who are like cut from the same cloth, but in the ways we don't need. Where when our parents are selecting options for us, they're choosing people who may seem less magnetic to us on the surface, but who would be more deep, stable, long-term marriage partners than if we chose ourselves. I don't know if I answered your question.
Channeling Diana Fleischman earlier and behavioral genetics. So I agree with the talk, very interesting and insightful, but the point about divorce causing certain kinds of social outcomes, how do you know that's true versus the kind of people who are more likely to get divorced or the kind of people who are passing on traits that create those outcomes?
Yeah, I think there is a significant impact. I think there's a significant genetic impact. Reed's selfish reasons to have more kids, like Yes, I think that that's all right. And I don't really know where the line should be drawn there, like what we should expect. I do know that like people will come into my office with pretty healthy kids. Oh, I'm in negative time now. Pretty healthy kids, and then they go through this dysfunctional family law system and their family breaks up and then they're in a worse position. So I think there is some effect. I just don't know how much of it. Yeah, thank you. You can ask me questions later. I'll be around.